Anonymous Code, the 6th mainline SciADV entry, is infamous for having taken over 7 years to release after its initial announcement. Considering most SciADV titles were made within the span of 1 to 3 years, what exactly made Anonymous Code take so long to develop? And what were the origins of the idea of Anonymous Code? Buckle up and get ready for a history lesson. Just a disclaimer, this video contains spoilers for the entire science adventure series up to and including Anonymous Code. Now, Anonymous Code was originally announced in March of 2015, but to truly convey its origins, we must go all the way back to the year 2006, when 5PB founder Chiyomaru Shakura proposed the idea of a sci-fi visual novel in Shibuya, initially going by the name of I-Sword, a game designed to blur the boundary between the real and fake, the boundary between delusion and reality. After iterating upon this idea, the game was eventually retitled into Project C.O.D.E by 2007. As per the Chaos-Head Axiom book, the ultimate twist of Project C.O.D.'s narrative was that the characters were all in a simulated, delusionary world. Did their world not being real make their existences meaningless? Would that have made the game completely meaningless too? I wonder. The Project C.O.D.E version of the game's scenario was scrapped and reworked into later iterations, with the game being retitled to Gigalomaniacs and finally Chaos-Head. But while the final plotline in Chaos-Head and its expanded re-release Chaos-Head Noah were completely different, it still kept the same thematic core and a number of the same sets of key ideas, namely the staunch belief in the validity of artificial existences, as well as a persistent questioning of the true nature of the world, just like science itself seeks to do. These ideas would fundamentally become the philosophical backbone of not only Chaos-Head, but also the rest of the SciADV franchise, and especially Anonymous Code, the notion that things matter even if they aren't real. After all, is the scenery your eyes perceive truly real? While not done in the same exact way as Project C.O.D.'s iteration of the story, Chaos-Head Noah still nonetheless began SciADV with a plethora of hints about the truth behind the series' world. In story, Takumi constantly has delusions upon delusions about him being in a simulated world where he was in a video game and there was some player out there who was observing and controlling him. After all, whose eyes are those eyes? Meanwhile, Chaos-Head Noah's Senna and Ayase roots would jointly serve to make these points far more explicit, with narrative centering around interference from beings at a higher layer of existence, a mechanical god in Senna's root, and a spiritual higher power in Ayase's root. The reveals from these chapters, and especially the Senna root, would fundamentally serve to establish one of the most essential aspects of SciADV's overall setting, and the biggest elephant in the room within the series. If you were to believe the people typing in the terminal, then that would mean that 1. The series was taking place in a multi-layered simulation. 2. The simulation had a system of error-correcting mechanisms like the debuggers. 3. It is possible for these errors to bypass the error-correcting mechanisms like the baby at the end of the Senna root. And 4. The Committee of 300 in the same layer of existence as the cast of Chaos-Head Noah doesn't actually exist. These points were corroborated by the series' creators in the Science Adventure series Maniac's Guidebook, which indicated that there were 2 key interpretations of the Senna root. Either you believed the people typing in the terminal, in which case the series was in a simulation, or you did not, in which case it wasn't necessarily in one. Chaos-Head Noah on its own never truly gave a definitive answer about which interpretation was correct. Was the series in a simulation, or were all these continuous hints just red herrings? And if they were red herrings, how would you explain the events and mechanics of the story? Each and every part of the series that followed would have several moments in story hinting at the world being simulated, be it character speculation or story events. In addition, the lyrics of almost every song would have some sort of allusion to the idea of being in a fake, simulated world, an idea that would continue to persist all throughout SciADV. Over the next several years, 5PB, later known as Mages, would release the next few SciADV entries and numerous dedicated pieces of side material, which would increasingly build the overarching series narrative, and also its overarching mysteries, from the true nature of the series' world, to the true nature of the Committee of 300, to the true nature of this enigmatic monochrome space. Of course, the truth behind this monochrome space was finally addressed in the final version of Anonymous Code. But the idea of this monochrome space was prevalent all throughout SciADV, with its origins in Chaos at Noah and allusions to it continuously persisting in mainline games and side entries beyond it. In the years before Anonymous Code was announced, there were 3 key Steins Gate side stories that focused on it: the 2010 Variant Space Octet, the 2013 Load Region of Deja Vu, and the 2014 Linear Bounded Mosaicism. I want to focus in on Load Region of Deja Vu particularly, not simply because it had the most overt description of beyond the load region, but because it's where the ideas for Anonymous Code were first discussed publicly. With the movie's launch came an accompanying pamphlet, which included a number of comments by the creators. On the very first page was a reflection from series creator Chiyomaru Shakura, who went on length to discuss the Time Leap machine's relation to the save and load system seen in video games, as well as his view of the distinction between a protagonist and a game's player. These comments would serve as the first time that SciADV staff would ever discuss the mechanics they wanted to play about using in Anonymous Code. From interviews, we know that around 2012 or 2013 was when they first started planning and concepting Anonymous Code, and the movie pamphlet comments are seemingly evidence of their first few Anonymous Code-related ideas being spoken about publicly. But production on Anonymous Code itself would seemingly not begin until 2015, the year they finally announced the project to the public via a Twitch-casting livestream. At the time of this livestream in March of 2015, Chiyomaru Shakura had announced Anonymous Code to be separate from SciADV and part of what was known as the Science Visual Novel series, which included both itself and Occultic 9. Despite this, however, Anonymous Code and Steins Gate Zero, the latter of which was also announced in the same exact livestream, had marketing that seemingly interconnected the two via the SA-4D satellite, with Anonymous Code's placement in the series being unclear. In clarifying comments in 2016, Chiyomaru would state that Anonymous Code was a SciADV game, but that it was classified differently to make it seem more welcoming to newcomers. All this while, Anonymous Code was planned for release in winter of 2016. And following the initial trailer that dropped in March of 2015, they would drop a brand new one in February of 2016, this time with all new character designs, ones that were quite different from those originally shown back in 2015. Over the next several months, they would follow up on this trailer with interview comments claiming that the game's story had been 90% written and that it was on track for a winter release. Shortly afterward, Mages would publicly unveil footage for the first chapter of Anonymous Code in September of 2016 at the Tokyo Game Show. The footage they showed depicted the high hack plotline, which was ultimately seen in Chapter 3 of the retail version of the story, albeit quite different from how it was depicted in the 2016 version of the story. But then a few months later, 2016 had come to an end, and Anonymous Code had not yet released. Nonetheless, in a New Year's message, the SciADV Twitter account affirmed that Anonymous Code would be releasing by the end of 2017, and so SciADV fans remained patient, expecting the game to release later that year. After all, the 2016 Occultic 9 anime depicted sad mourning from Anonymous Code in its opening, thus there was still the expectation that the game was indeed still coming. But then 2017 ended, and Anonymous Code was still nowhere to be seen. At the time, many were wondering, what on earth happened to Anonymous Code? As we would learn later on in post-release interviews, sometime in 2017, the game's story, despite being almost completed, had been largely scrapped due to dissatisfaction with its quality. At this point in time, the writing team had gone through some changes, with Ayano Suehiro being brought on board to assist Naota Takahashi in building the scenario. But with them having to rebuild the story from scratch, development time ballooned well past what was planned. For most of 2018, the SciADV team would give little word on the status of anonymous code. That year, their focus was on the long-awaited Steins Gate Zero anime and Steins Gate Elite. But like Occultic 9, these projects also included a number of allusions to anonymous code, both within in-story imagery and song lyrics. As people would later come to know when anonymous code actually did release, several songs in Occultic 9, Steins Gate Elite, and the Steins Gate Zero anime had lyrics that were specifically referencing events depicted in anonymous code. For instance, Annie's Ring foreshadowing the apocalypse, and Cosmic Looper foreshadowing the final encounter between Polon and Momo. So evidently, many of the final developments seen in the retail version of anonymous code had been planned ideas even in much earlier versions of the game scenario. On a Twitcasting livestream towards the end of 2018, Chiyamaru Shakura would then unveil his development schedule for the future, with anonymous code having been listed for a 2019 release alongside Robotics Notes Dash and Occultic 9 New World. Meanwhile, an anonymous code anime was scheduled to release 2 years later in 2021. As we know, aside from Robotics Notes Dash, none of those things ended up happening. For several months, silence continued, and mages had been facing a very turbulent period, having bought themselves out from Kadokawa and going independent. This move sacrificed the company's ability to go deep into multimedia developments, but gained them creative freedom. However, this freedom was very short-lived, and Mages was then sold to Colopole for much less than Shakura bought it for. During this time, Mages had very few releases whatsoever, and many of the company's resources had been dedicated to anonymous code, though repeatedly they would write and rewrite the game scenario over and over again. This was due to a number of different reasons: general dissatisfaction with the story, time progression rendering certain topics outdated and obsolete, concurrent events affecting the content that was supposed to be depicted in-game, and also needing to make things consistent with other SciADV titles. With the constant rewriting, by September of 2019, Shakura stated that the project had been delayed to 2020, but that he would like to release it no later than the Tokyo Olympics. However, in only a few short months afterward, in January of 2020, Mages would then announce a delay to winter of 2021 when they released a new anonymous code trailer for the first time in almost 4 years. This trailer was joint with one for Steins Gate Elite, and would feature footage and key visuals that didn't make it to the final version of the story. In this iteration of the story, the first encounter with Momo had her in regular clothes as opposed to her iconic catsuit. People who received review copies for the final version of the game actually got one CG, seemingly from this particular iteration of the story. Nonetheless, within the span of 2.5 years, the story underwent a number of different changes. Flash forward to October of 2020, and Mages would host a livestream wherein, amidst other major announcements, they dropped a fourth trailer for Anonymous Code. This time, further delaying the game to fall of 2021, and cancelling the PlayStation Vita release of the game due to development time having gone well past its life cycle. At the time, Chiyamaru Shakura stated that the game was 50% done, and that he believed they could finish it up within the span of a year. However, in less than 2 months after this livestream, the Arecibo Observatory would completely collapse, forcing them to yet again make significant cuts and changes to the story to align with real-life events affecting the narrative they wanted to portray. Eventually, it was already fall of 2021, and Anonymous Code was still not yet out. In an interview with Makoto Asada toward the end of that year, Mages had formally delayed the game to 2022 to brush up its quality. It was hardly a surprise that the game had yet again been delayed. But in the meantime, they would port Chaos Noah to modern platforms after over 7 years since its last release on the PlayStation Vita. With how reliant Anonymous Code ended up being on the context of Chaos Noah, this was a fitting move, and may have even been a reason for why they ported it at the time. Nonetheless, it was a period of optimism and excitement within the SciADV community, despite the uncertainty surrounding Anonymous Code. But at the end of 2021 would come a pleasant surprise at Comiket 99, a reveal of in-game CGs for the very first time. At long last, it seemed the game's release was in sight. Flash forward to March, and Sakura would announce via Twitter that he would be releasing a 5th trailer for Anonymous Code and hosting a live stream playing through the first chapter of the game shortly afterward. On March 18th, this new trailer would drop, and in a separate announcement, the company confirmed that the game would be releasing on July 28th, 2022. At long last, the game's release date was in sight, and people were very excited that their wait was coming to an end. This excitement only grew when on April 1st of 2022, Tsumaro Sakura streamed the first 2 hours of the game, showing off the rapid-fast, action-packed, and beautifully produced start to the final version of the game. The same day, Mages also launched its digital store pages and pre-orders. The game was at long last actually coming out. Nonetheless, during this time period, the writing team continued to make adjustments to the scenario until the very last minute. But this did not stop Mages from actively marketing the project for the next several months, releasing a multitude of pre-launch trailers and showcasing in-game footage regularly on livestreams. Leading up to its release, Mages soft confirmed via encrypted hints on their Facebook page that the game was getting an English localization. This was later confirmed at Spike Chunsoft's panel at Anime Expo 2022 at the beginning of July. As it turned out, the game was being localized by veteran SciADV translator Andrew Hodgson, not outsourced to a third-party company with little familiarity with the series the way the previous localizations had been. So for English-speaking fans, the anticipation for its release grew tremendously, and for Japanese fans, the release was just a few weeks away. Eventually, it was July 28th, and the long-awaited 6th mainline SciADV entry, the long-awaited grand culmination of the series storyline, finally released in Japan. In the aftermath of its release, the development team expressed tremendous relief at the fact that the game had finally released after more than 7 long years of development. As per interviews, the scenario team grew to feel as though they themselves were in a time loop when in meetings for the project, due to how many times they would repeatedly adjust and change the scenario over the years. At some point, there had been talks of cancelling the project entirely, but they persevered, and the game ultimately did release, albeit with a story that was completely different from what they had originally envisioned. From a project originally advertised as separate from SciADV, it ended up being the grand culmination of the series, and arguably its most important entry to date. Parts of their philosophy remained consistent from conception. For instance, the general design in having a linear story with many bad endings, as opposed to a traditional Galgay-like heroine route structure. This was something they had planned right from the beginning as part of their artistic vision. But certain story elements ended up being changed drastically along development. In earlier iterations of Anonymous Code's story, Momo was also able to save and load, just like Polon, and by the beginning of the game, Momo had already been through the story's events once before. However, they ultimately scrapped this gimmick because they found it was too messy to write. In addition, they had also planned on Polon going into outer space in the ending, rather than beyond the load region as he did in the retail release. In the end, Anonymous Code had many concepts and settings that didn't make it into the final release in order to make for a cohesive narrative. Nonetheless, the series staff indicated that they would have liked to have seen some of those points covered either in supplementary material or in a fan disc. For English-speaking fans, it would be over a year until the localization would release as well, but when it did, on September 8th of 2023, it released with a stellar English translation, and for the first time in series history, a full-fledged English dub. I had the opportunity to play the localization early and review the game just prior to its release, and I, and most other reviewers out there, absolutely adored it. It was so challenging to shut up about the game prior to the review embargo. I can't count the number of times I screamed while playing the game, with how much of the franchise it drastically recontextualized with its crazy number of reveals. Within the span of a few months of its English release, the Committee of Zero released their fan patch for Anonymous Code, bringing quality of life, consistency, and accessibility improvements. Because of the English dub, they ended up making both a full patch and a partial patch, the latter being designed for English dub players via consistency with voice lines. Nonetheless, their anonymous code patch ended up being their smallest scale project ever at the time due to the overall strength of the game's official localization. For an English-speaking SciADV fan, this was quite an exciting time to be present in the community. But ever since the game's English release, little has happened with the anonymous code IP. As per Shakura's comments on stream, there appear to be some developments taking place in the background that he is unable to speak about too much, but he has recently proposed the idea of self-funding an anonymous code anime, acting as a one-person production committee. Will this end up happening? Only time will tell. As challenging as it would be to do an anonymous code anime, I would love to see it happen one day, and I would absolutely love a sequel, fan disc, or side material for anonymous code, as the staff had wanted to do. But alas, we wait for that time. And we also wait for the next mainline SciADV entry, which has similarly been facing an anonymous code-like development hell due to taking place far in the future and centering around the topic of technological singularity. From the looks of things, maybe it will end up taking more than 7 years to release. But ultimately, anonymous code took so long not because they didn't know what to write, but because it was depicting a story too far ahead into the future. It was a futuristic tale that was continuously clashing with the creators' latest vision of the future. The game's in-story events and revelations were largely what they had planned ever since the beginning of the series, and a lot of what ended up being in the final version of the game was there since very early on in development. But with there being so many real-world events that affected the game's content, and there being substantial progression in technology, their vision for the future kept changing constantly. We now stand less than 10 years away from the year 2036 problem. Let's see what the world has in store for us. Thank you for watching, everyone. Special thank you to Fasty, Martin, Eneravan, and Archifix. And happy 4th anniversary to Anonymous Code. Until next time.